We're very happy today to have Dr. Megan Cattau,
Cattau.
Tattoo,
Yeah.
okay, join us and give us a talk. So take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here to speak with you all. So thanks for taking the time to join me. Standing in a recently burned landscape, you can see patterns, areas of high severity, remnant trees, early signs of recovery, and those same patterns exist in our data. We can capture them with satellites, with planes, with drones, and we can use those data to observe, model, and even predict what our landscapes will look like into the future. But wildfire isn't just something we observe. It's something we experience on the ground, in specific places, and over time. And those experiences shape how people understand risk, how they make decisions, and imagine what might come next. So today I'll share how I design and use creative technologies to mediate relationships between people, environmental data, and place, shaping how environmental systems are understood and acted upon. So stepping back, fire fundamentally shapes both ecological landscapes and human communities. From the ecological side, it's estimated that about 53% of Earth's ecoregions are fire dependent. So wildfires are a vital and natural component of many ecosystems. From the social side, fire has linked people closely with their environment across millennia. Communities have developed policies, social networks, and collaborative strategies around the use of fire to manage wildfire risk and to respond to individual wildfire events, which in turn shapes community identity and even things like community structure. However, as climate and land use rapidly change, the role of fire on Earth is also changing, resulting in profound effects to our social ecological systems, ranging from ecosystem decline to increased human vulnerability to natural hazards. As one example, some of my work has shown that human ignitions are reshaping fire here in the United States. Human ignitions are increasing over time in the US, which you can see here, and some fire characteristics like frequency and season length also increased with increased human ignitions, which you can see in those figures there. And human ignitions are also changing spatial temporal patterns of fire in the United States. And the point here is that fire regimes at this point are really co-produced by human as well as biophysical controls. Oh, you can admit people, okay, great. Satellite observations have transformed our understanding of fire activity. So along with technological advances like increased processing power and increased model sophistication, we're able to detect change and make predictions in a way that we never could have even anticipated even 50 years ago. But wildfire isn't just a physical system, it's a wicked problem. It's a complex, multifaceted issue that can't be solved with a single approach. I think of it as a social ecological system. And I think of it specifically as a linked social ecological system. And I'll say SES probably a lot in this talk to mean social ecological system, just to flag that acronym from the onset. I think of wildfire issues as a function of local to larger scale fire patterns and processes, which you can see on the left side of this graph here, which feed back with individual to larger scale wildfire management practices and organizations, which you can see on the top right there, everything from individual and household level decisions to multinational organizations. And one new component that I've added to this general framework of linked social ecological systems is affected people, which you can see on the bottom right. People whose lives are altered either positively or negatively by fire and who are often also making decisions around wildfire management. And that's why those two groups on the right are overlapping. I'll be showing projects that are situated across this diagram today. The subfields that I draw from, which are not mutually exclusive, just to orient you there, are remote sensing and geospatial modeling, immersive and interactive technologies, biogeography and landscape ecology, restoration and disturbance ecology, environmental justice, risk, natural hazards and disaster research, and environmental governance. And just to speak to my positionality a little bit as well, I'm a trained ecologist. My PhD is in ecology and evolution. I have a master's in environmental management, and that informs my thinking about social ecological systems. My undergraduate studies, on the other hand, were in visual art with a focus on environmental ethics. And I worked professionally for a few years as a dancer and a visual artist and maintain those practices still to this day. So that background informs a lot of my thinking around human experience and around meaning making, both of which are going to be relevant in the talk today. So I think of wildfire as a multi-scalar and extremely interdisciplinary system, making wildfire management challenging, especially given the complexity and the uncertainty associated with wildfire. Which begs the question, how do we make complex, uncertain systems interpretable and actionable? So much of my research is focused on remote sensing, modeling, and ecological inference around wildfire and other disturbances. And generating that fundamental SES knowledge remains a critical part of the problem and a central part of my work. But today, I want to focus on another dimension of that same research program, designing systems for environmental sense-making. Today, I'll focus on how I integrate creative technology with social-ecological system science to mediate relationships, again, between people, data, and place. So all the work I'll show is grounded in empirical social-ecological systems analysis, primarily remote sensing and other spatial products. In this context, artifacts like maps, models, and data sets act as boundary objects. So they provide a shared reference point that different groups can use to engage with a complex system, in this case, wildfire. Boundary objects are really useful in the context of systems thinking. And what I'm interested in is how creative technologies reconfigure how people engage with those objects, how data is interpreted, experienced, and ultimately acted upon. So across the projects that I'll discuss today, I work across 3 different modes of knowing: empirical, which involves data, models, analysis; interpretive, which involves narrative, embodiment, affect; and participatory, which involves community lived experience and decision-making. So together, this work explores how creative technology can move environmental data across these modes, making complex systems more interpretable and more actionable. This is especially important, I think, in wildfire systems where we're constantly negotiating between ecological dynamics, policy constraints, and lived experience. So many of the systems I show are intentionally developed as prototypes, designed to explore how immersive and other technologies can support different ways of knowing rather than as fully polished products to flag that. So the emphasis is on engaging the environmental data rather than on the tool itself. So I want to first note how my broader work is organized scientifically. The work addresses how disturbance regimes and recovery are shaped by ecological and human processes. In all these projects, there's an explicit focus on advancing the technical use of remote sensing and other geospatial data. And my projects generally address fire vegetation interactions, fire landscape ecology, fire management and intervention efforts, environmental justice, and land use and land cover. And I'll focus on 3 main topic areas today that are highlighted in red on the screen. Across these projects, I use remote sensing and geospatial data to generate fundamental knowledge about social ecological systems. And across all these projects, I also design immersive and interactive systems. Again, they draw from the same analytical pipeline, remote sensing and geospatial modeling, but they activate fundamentally different ways of knowing. So what I'll show today is on the empirical side, I build immersive tools for data discovery that support model-based reasoning. Moving toward interpretive work, that same data becomes material for narrative exploration through VR installations. And in the next project, or the second project, data informs embodied performance in immersive spaces. And in participatory context, the final project uses XR to support dialogue and collective decision-making among community members and wildfire managers. And some projects sit in between these modes. So for example, AR tools for decision support, which connects empirical analysis with real-world action. So this first project uses immersive environments built from UAS, or unoccupied aerial systems drones, derived vegetation data. This project spans all 3 modes, analytical, interpretive, and participatory contexts, using the same underlying data in different ways. So I just mentioned this a few slides ago, but this is a system in which immersive and interactive technologies are used to move across all these ways of knowing. So the ecosystem science and remote sensing science context of this work is that mapping invasive species is key for sagebrush conservation. So today, the sagebrush ecosystem covers about half of its original extent, and invasive plant species, including cheatgrass, are one of the most prominent threats. And I'm talking about sagebrush systems today, but anyone who spent time in the trails of Boulder, like maybe even in your yard, you've encountered cheatgrass, most likely. Climate change has been the catalyzing force of invasive species establishment and spread, and has worked in tandem with changing fire regimes in this area. So more fire begets more invasive species, begets more fire. Detecting and mapping invasive species over large spatial extents is a requisite first step toward eradicating them, really at the scales commensurate with the scale of the problem. So in a sagebrush system near Boise, Idaho, we flew a multispectral sensor on a UAS or a drone in order to map a variety of invasive species. And that was cheatgrass, fir buttercup, as well as Russian thistle, if you're familiar with those. However, mapping species with remote sensing is complicated by the fact that different species can be spectrally similar at any point in time, meaning they can look the same, right? And that's true whether you're looking at them with the naked eye, or with a drone, or with a plane, or satellite-derived imagery. Here's an example of a native bunchgrass squirreltail on the left and invasive cheatgrass on the right, and they both look green in this moment in time, right? Green for this like extremely dry ecosystem anyway. And they also both looked near infrared, right, in our drone imagery. So we were wondering how to solve this problem that the species look similar, right, to separate them in the drone imagery. And so we started just exploring our drone imagery. So in doing this exploration, we ran into a practical challenge. UAS data are collected to capture expansive landscapes. And the products you make from these data sets are complex and they're high dimensional. They're typically explored on tiny laptop screens. I mean, you might have an external monitor or two if you're lucky, but that can limit what we can actually perceive in the data. So the question became, how do we encounter and explore these data in ways that support discovery? So we use an immersive space for data exploration, for data discovery. I was part of a faculty learning community around digital accessibility and interactive learning environments that used an immersive space at Boise State called the Luminary. It includes, digital touchscreen walls and immersive projection. So in this context, I developed an interactive visualization system for drone-based data within the Luminary, where participants could engage with the data at scale in a shared immersive environment. This is designed to test how people engage with these representations in immersive spaces. So participants, including students and collaborators, interacted with the data in real time using a structured question formulation process as we manipulated the visualizations across space. So rather than functioning as a way to display the data, the system supported exploratory encounters with the data prior to formal analysis, with the intent of seeding ideas for formal analysis. So we found that visualizing these data at scale in immersive spaces enabled a shift in perspective. So in this case, we saw that drone imagery taken even just a little over a week apart looked really different in some areas, comparing the two time steps, and exactly identical in other areas, comparing the two time steps. So we thought about using these unique spectral patterns over time that we saw in the space to see if we could detect different species in a time series of remotely sensed images. So species have unique timing, right, of when they green up and when they brown down over the year. And these differences in phenology or differences in the timing of growing cycles between species could allow us to map them. So this approach more generally has been used with satellite data for over a decade and a half. But satellite data is relatively coarse at 7 to 30 meter resolution. For systems like this with really heterogeneous vegetation, it's not a solution. But the drone imagery can be centimeter scale, right? So we used this insight, generated through immersive and interactive systems to develop our remote sensing methodological approach and to refine our research questions. So this is an example of how immersive systems like this support curiosity-driven and collaborative inquiry, shaping what analytical approaches we take, what questions we ask, and how we ask them. So these new insights enabled our quantitative analysis. We collected drone data every 2 weeks from March to November to see if we could capture those species-specific patterns over time, again, in order to map those species. And from our drone imagery, this is a time series animation of normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI. It's an index that approximates vegetation health. So you can see green up and brown down over time in this image. We ran a suite of multiple machine learning models to classify the UAS data, or to assign each pixel to a species, basically, using NDVI from all of those dates. And we found that an ensemble method had over 94% accuracy. And just for context, anything over about 75% is considered pretty good in the remote sensing literature. So here is that classified image that just shows you the different species and how they're distributed on the landscape. So these data pipelines that we built using phenology to classify species in drone imagery and that we conceptualized in the immersive environment proved to be an effective strategy to differentiate these species. And we could not have conceptualized this methodological approach had we not been in the Luminary to explore that data in that way. I was also motivated to increase the utility of this work for on-the-ground management, so moving into decision support here. This is a prototype AR system that I'm developing with a team of students in our Games, Interactive Media, and Mobile Technology, or GIM program at Boise State. It takes UAS-derived models and anchors them directly to the landscape where the data were collected, allowing users to view and interact with that information in place through a tablet or a mobile device to support decisions in the field. So let me play that video. The AR anchoring tool uses a focus entity to place the mesh, and then apologies for the quality of video, but in this example, what you'll see in a minute is natural color drone imagery overlaid on the landscape. And users can also access additional data or contextual information about different features by tapping on them. So this is all drone imagery overlaid on the actual sagebrush landscape. And again, it's natural color, so it's a little hard to distinguish it from the natural color of the real landscape. But building on this initial prototype, I'm interested in developing more sophisticated immersive systems and deeper approaches to user experience. We are now iterating with land managers to tailor this for applications like using classified imagery, meaning that imagery that shows the species locations, to identify treatment areas for invasive species management. We've also collected thermal imagery to identify microclimate refugia that could improve planting success for restoration planting. And there's some things I think I could do uniquely at Atlas as well. So I've used VR to support dialogue among multiple stakeholders, but AR creates an opportunity to bring those conversations into the landscape itself, displaying data-supported scenarios directly in place. And so more broadly, this opens up a direction for using AR for supporting situated, in-context decision-making. So far we've been focusing on how these systems support analytical workflows that take us from observation to action. And I want to now shift to how they shape interpretation outside of those analytical workflows with a narrative system for interpretation. So once we had these UAS products, I wanted to create a way for people to actively engage with them, to explore patterns and make them interpretable. So this led to the development of an XR system. I worked with GIM again, with a student dev team to develop a virtual reality application that integrates our drone-derived NDVI time series into an interactive environment. So the welcome screen provides some overall context, there are instructions on how to navigate, and then the user can scroll through the NDVI time series to see the phenological changes, along with some contextual information. So you can see the landscape from a drone's eye view nadir, meaning directly overhead, or a more natural view angle. The goal was to allow the users to move through environmental data across space and time, rather than viewing it as a static map. And then the ultimate goal was for the VR system to function as visual and material narrative for interpreting environmental systems. So this work was part of a larger exhibition, Human Relationships to Western Landscapes, which was included in the European Cultural Center's Personal Structures exhibition. So in that context, the XR environment sits alongside other media to foreground human relationships to place during a time of ecological disruption. So what this demonstrates is that XR environments can contribute to how knowledge is formed, not only as analytical tools, but as artifacts that really shape how people relate to and can interpret environmental change, especially when they're in dialogue with other forms of representation. So I want to take a step back here and mention that another dimension that's critical to my work, including in this project, is stakeholder engagement that's grounded in the science of co-production as a discipline. So a lot of my projects involve collaboration with land managers, communities, and decision makers. So I think a lot in design spaces about how technologies function in real governance and risk contexts. So with this work, we had interviews with a variety of land managers, including these folks, and we took a co-production approach that's reflective of the general approach in my lab, in which we follow the principles of co-production to produce knowledge, products, and tools, where we engage interactively and reflexively throughout the process. We have collaborative and joint decision-making around everything from the scope and scale of the problem all the way to implementation of solutions. There's transparency and accountability that's grounded in mutual learning and shared power, which allows for a pluralistic approach that's really context-based. So this approach is critical to increase the chances that the tools have management relevance. And I also want to note that one of my current graduate students is focusing on the science of co-production itself in a different project. And so co-production science is something we employ in my lab as well as advance the theory of. I also want to mention the importance of student involvement in this and all of our projects and how I think about research, learning, and service as being really fully integrated. So one example is an undergraduate and graduate certificate program that I founded and direct called DOVER. So the Drone Operations for Visualization, Research, and Resource Management. This acronym has been rejected. People call it the drone program. It's DOVER, just in case you're talking about it. So drone operations, by their nature, lend themselves well to experiential learning, team learning, and we also incorporate service learning into the classroom, including civic engagement, which allows for co-production with partners on shared products, often with immersive and interactive technologies as the center of those collaborations. So this program provides the structure and training that allows students to contribute meaningfully while allowing stakeholders to access and engage with data in ways that reflect their own priorities. So the Dover students have been working with a variety of partners on several projects, including the phenology project that I just showed, not just to collect the US data and to create products and tools, but also to engage with the partners in joint decision-making. So learning about co-production science as they create these tools and products. So this demonstrates how I integrate co-production into project-based work in technology-focused, product-oriented settings, aligning closely with Atlas's Studio Lab model. So for this project, in conclusion, what did these immersive environments change about how we understand the system? Immersive, interactive environments enabled data exploration that contributed to a novel remote sensing approach for detecting and mapping invasive plant species in the system. AR supported management action, and then VR environments created narrative systems for environmental meaning making. Okay. Moving on to the second project, this project uses immersive environments built from satellite-based fire data to explore wildfire dynamics. This project sits primarily in the interpretive mode. So here, satellite fire data is translated into embodied performance in an immersive space. So while the work draws from the same analytical pipeline, the emphasis shifts from reasoning about the system to experiencing the system. So this is a project that I am going to speak about. It's called Scydance. I directed and choreographed this 2017 when I was a postdoc here at CU Boulder in the series Earth Lab. This project brings together remote sensing data and performance with a designed technology-mediated environment. In this case, that was the Atlas Black Box Experimental Studio in this very building that we're in. So the performance had 3 acts, each beginning with an Earth system scientist delivering a short research flash talk in the traditional academic format, followed by a dance response. It was a cerebral and kinesthetic meditation on Earth system processes. While the project did communicate science, the primary goal was to design a different way of engaging with it, one that was grounded in perception, movement, and spatial experience. So underlying this work is the idea that the body provides grounding for how understanding is constructed. So we know that cognition is grounded in part, at least, in sensory and motor systems, right? And so in this work, embodiment functions as a form of environmental sense-making, one that engages affect and physical experience alongside environmental analysis. So the body becomes an interface through which environmental systems are interpreted. One of the acts in Scydance focused on my fire research, and I want to show you some of that research and then speak about the process of integrating it in with the dancers. So at the most basic level, fire regimes are dictated by ignition source, appropriate meteorological conditions for burning like moisture and sufficient fuel, all of which interact with each other and can be affected by and affect people. We're going to focus on ignitions here. So before large-scale land use change, most fires, about 90%, were started by lightning, and about 10% were started by people. But since large-scale land use change, that trend is totally reversed. So it's estimated that about 90% of global biomass fires are started by people, and 10% now started by lightning. So a key component to understanding changing fire is identifying the source of those fire ignitions, meaning where the fire starts and where those fires spread to. As I mentioned before, satellite observations have transformed our understanding of fire activity, in part because they allow for generalizable inference, and that's critical, right? However, there are many limitations to using satellite data. And one of the many is that it's not always possible to identify ignitions, where specifically a fire started, and to track spread from satellite data. This is primarily because satellite data are delivered as pixels, right, or grid cells. And these are just some example fire data. In these examples, a pixel is flagged if a fire was burning at the time of satellite overpass, and that's indicated here with a black dot. So any pixel with a black dot, that means there was a fire when the satellite overpassed that area. But the reality on the ground that those data represent could look like a lot of different things. So for these example data, multiple fire detections in adjacent pixels could be multiple small isolated fires with separate ignition sources, or larger contiguous fires with a single ignition source per fire. Again, these two different fire scenarios would result in data that could look identical. And that's quite different on the ground, right? It has different implications for what's happening on the ground. So let's say the reality on the ground looked like some combination of those two scenarios like this. And I developed a hierarchical clustering algorithm that has both spatial and temporal rules to group those fire detections into fire events, and then identified the ignition locations as the earliest detection within a cluster. So quite simply, this allowed me to capture where a fire started and the extent of its spread. This was applied over Indonesia, where most of the land is cleared through fire, so there's a lot of human fire, where the burning of peatlands contributes substantially to global greenhouse gas emissions, and also where ignition locations and fire boundaries or fire perimeters are not made available nationally. So this is a graphic representation of those fire events in Indonesia overlaid on different land use land cover classes. You can see these yellow detections clustered into fire events, which are outlined in red here. The ignition detections are highlighted in red and the spread direction is noted. So we can track where these fires started and where they spread, which has implications for land use policy. We use this algorithm and the data for a variety of SES applications with an empirical or analytical framework. And here's the data release for those clustered fire events and a handful of resulting papers in Indonesia and also some global work over the last year. But here I want to focus on how remote sensing data, that clustering algorithm, was translated into an embodied interactive system. So the goal, again, with Scydance, going back to Scydance, was to move this work into an interpretive mode. So engaging fire dynamics through perception, movement, and spatial experience. So consistent with design research principles, both the process and the performance were treated as central outcomes of the work, not just the performance. So the project was developed through an iterative collaboration between scientists and dancers. The development process of each act began with a scientific briefing. The scientists shared data, models, visualizations. And in the case of the fire act, again, that scientist was me in like an extended version of what I just showed you. And from there, for each act, we moved into improvisation, where I asked the dancers to interpret and translate environmental processes into movement. Scientists began to see their work through movement. Dancers engaged with complex dynamics through the body, and the collaboration created shared understanding across disciplines. So the collaborative process happened in an aerial dance studio, but the black box environment staged the result as an immersive system, bringing data, movement, and space together in a shared experience with the audience. So the data functioned as a shared reference point where the meaning of the system was shaped through embodied exploration. So in this context, remote sensing data became a medium for interpretation and communication, and it supported the process of co-creating meaning together in that space. So this is another way of engaging the same underlying patterns we study analytically, right? Spatial structure, dynamics, change over time, but expressed through the body and immersive spaces rather than maps or models, or in addition to maps or models, I should say. So just stepping back, my background in visual art and professional performance experience gives me a distinct orientation toward embodiment and human experience. And I want to mention that that Scydance project sits within a broader body of existing movement work. And that includes aerial dance, as well as Buto, which is a movement form that trains the body to attend to perception and internal experience as a basis for the movement, rather than there being a codified movement vocabulary like you might see in ballet. So it's often focused on dissolving the boundary between the body and the environment. I also co-direct an annual curated multimedia arts platform called Unfix NYC with my collaborator Yoko, who you can see there, where we explore environmental themes through collaborative, cross-disciplinary, technological, and artistic work, including centralizing Buto work there. So this practice informs how I approach Scydance, not just as a performance, but as a way of engaging and understanding environmental systems through the body. I've also begun exploring the use of physiological sensors, so heart rate monitors, to show internal states, and that's something I'd be very interested to develop further if I were here at Atlas. So for this project, a novel clustering approach to satellite fire data enables scalable analysis of fire dynamics, while embodied systems create new modes of interaction with those data, shaping how they're understood and communicated across scientists, performers, and audiences. So for the last project, this is new work that's just started within the last 6 months. So I'll be showing you some preliminary work and some future plans. This is a career grant that is a combination of social behavioral and biophysical sciences. So this project uses XR systems built from geospatial data and landscape imagery to support environmental sense-making in community and decision-making contexts. So this work sits primarily in the participatory mode. So here, the geospatial data become a prompt for dialogue. They're used to elicit lived experience, local knowledge, and collective interpretation. So in some cases, like work with fire managers, these systems also support decision-making, bridging empirical analysis with practitioner expertise. So vulnerability has been defined a number of ways through various disciplinary lenses. But from my perspective, understanding social vulnerability in the context of wildfire hazards, meaning which populations are most at risk from wildfire impacts, requires an evaluation of wildfire exposure, just the co-occurrence of wildfire with people and property, sensitivity, which is often represented with socioeconomic and demographic variables, and adaptive capacity, which refers to the ability to manage or reduce risk from fire. And in many wildfire-affected communities, decisions are shaped by both data and lived experience, kind of in equal parts. And as I mentioned previously, geospatial and large-scale approaches are critical for generalizable inference, but then also participatory and place-based approaches are critical to capture situated knowledge, like lived experience, perception of risk, right? And also relational knowledge, so how people interpret data in context. So I want us to first consider the geospatial side here. Social vulnerability is understudied in the context of wildfire. In the US, there are only 2 national scale empirical analyses that exist that explore social vulnerability to wildfire, which is really surprising to me, just given the scale of the problem. So both of these 2 studies conclude that people most at risk of wildfire are socioeconomically advantaged. However, case studies have conflicting results from those larger scale studies, and they show that socioeconomically disadvantaged communities may suffer greater impacts from wildfire. So there are a few issues here that might put these studies at different scales at odds with each other, but the primary one from my perspective is that greater wildfire risk doesn't necessarily equate with worse wildfire impacts, right? And wildfire exposure can be moderated by a variety of other factors, including adaptive capacity, right? So meaning, it's simultaneously possible that advantaged communities are positioned in higher risk areas, but disadvantaged communities experience worse wildfire impacts. So I conducted a preliminary analysis. It's the first empirically derived and validated characterization of social vulnerability to wildfire at the US national scale, to my knowledge. And our preliminary analysis is showing that US populations with high sensitivity, meaning things like low income, mobile housing, other socioeconomic and demographic factors, which you're seeing here. So high sensitivity is higher on the X. They have simultaneously both higher wildfire exposure and also negative wildfire impacts. At the same time, those communities, those highly sensitive communities, receive lower government resource support, which is a problem. Because place-based knowledge, so pivoting away from the geospatial, because place-based knowledge is critical to understanding wildfire impacts, this project also focuses on participatory approaches to social vulnerability. So we work with affected community members to understand how wildfire is experienced and how people engage with adaptive action. To support this, I developed a structured participatory system called ArtLab. ArtLab is a design process that mediates between geospatial data and place-based community knowledge. So ArtLab begins with place. People's experiences with wildfire are inherently tied to specific landscapes, to specific geographies. And so we use images of wildfire impacted places, including geospatial data as the entry point, along with results of some of the empirical analyses that I just showed a moment ago around social vulnerability, some of those figures. So these images aren't just references, they ground discussion in place and act as prompts that structure how participants reflect on and represent their experiences. From there, participants engage in an iterative process of interpretation. They respond to these landscape representations through writing and creative practices, such as visualizing their experiences with wildfire. Those artifacts then become prompts for discussion and collective interpretation, where participants together identify shared themes. And this leads into collaborative activities, including environmental visioning for desired future states. So in this way, geospatial data and lived experience are brought into dialogue and they actively inform one another. So in initial pilot, we found that how people engage with landscape representation, so whether they're writing, art making, in discussion, and whether they're engaging individually or collectively, shapes what they notice, what they recall, and how they talk about risk. So in other words, the form of engagement with geospatial data actually shapes understanding and what's articulated. So this raises a key design question. How do different representations of landscape and different interfaces shape those interactions? And that's what I would build on here. So building on ArtLab, I'm interested in how variations in landscape representation, such as maps, satellite imagery, or higher resolution UAS data, and different interfaces, print, digital, or extended reality, might shape how people interpret and engage with those environmental data. So I'm interested in developing this direction of immersive systems to support participatory sense-making further, particularly if I were in an environment here like Atlas. So as part of this work, we're planning to extend ArtLab into decision-making contexts. So artifacts and narratives generated through ArtLab will be translated into multiple formats, including a VR module, and brought into conversation with wildfire managers. So the VR module will also be used in educational and public engagement settings. But the purpose here is to increase the meaningful involvement of affected people into decision-making. I think VR is a particularly useful tool here because it allows participants to engage with community-generated knowledge and environment scenarios in a shared spatial and experiential way. I will note that, prior work has highlighted the importance of user well-being in wildfire-related VR environments, and so we'll make sure to carefully and thoughtfully incorporate that into the design as well. So in this way, the VR acts as a bridge, connecting community knowledge with management contexts and supporting more inclusive decision-making. Yes. I also want to situate this work within a broader teaching and institutional context. So that pilot art lab that I just showed you took place in an art science integration course that I co-teach, where we take a lab studio hybrid approach. The students call this our Labudio, lab studio, which I really like that term. So in that class, we prototype ideas, we test assumptions and learn through making, while being supported by regular feedback and reflection. So experimentation, critique, and iteration are a central component of the class. So projects have included more traditional 2D art, but also digital and time-based art like sonification of genetic data and interactive pieces. So I see this approach as closely aligned with Atlas's studio-based model, where technical development and creative exploration happen in tandem and inform one another. So beyond individual projects, I'm a founding faculty member in our artsy community at Boise State, which is an interdisciplinary platform for inquiry and innovation. In that space, I often bring environmental systems and remote sensing into dialogue with creative and technological practices, which I'd be excited to extend within the Atlas ecosystem as well. So here I'm designing participatory systems that bring geospatial data and lived experience into an interaction. So geospatial analysis reveals which populations experience disproportionate wildfire impacts, while participatory systems that engage the data surface how risk is experienced and how environmental futures can be imagined. So today I've shown three facets of wildfire as a social-ecological system spanning landscape dynamics, human experience, and decision-making. And across these, I've been asking how creative technologies and design processes can support how we discover data, make meaning from those data, and ultimately act on those data. So this work represents early iterations in a broader research trajectory around creative technology for environmental sense-making. So creative technologies reshape how environmental data are encountered, interpreted, and acted upon. Across this work, immersive, embodied, and participatory systems transform engagement with remote sensing and complex environmental systems. These approaches extend geospatial analysis into experience, interpretation, and decision-making. And together, they connect data, people, and place in responding to environmental change. So my vision going forward is to establish an experiential environmental systems lab, where I would design immersive and interactive technologies to support new ways of knowing complex environmental systems, while simultaneously advancing fundamental ecological and social-ecological system science through novel data integration and analysis. So over the past decade plus, I've built a strong foundation in environmental system science alongside creative and participatory approaches. And that integration allows me to contribute both fundamental scientific insight and new tools and methodologies. And what I'm focusing on now is scaling that integration, developing systems where immersive technologies, participatory processes and environmental data are brought together intentionally. I think Atlas is really the ideal environment for that. I see this work contributing to and extending Atlas's strengths by bridging landscape scale systems, environmental risk, and participatory co-design into deeper dialogue with creative technologies and human experience. In addition to the research vision, this is how I think about building the lab. I would integrate research, teaching, and service through collaborative, interdisciplinary, team-based approaches, really with strong student involvement. Produce societally relevant, often co-produced knowledge in partnership with communities and practitioners, particularly around wildfire. And then broaden participation through inclusive approaches to environmental science and design. And that includes, I think, really who participates, right? Bringing in communities affected by wildfire, not just scientists, not just technologists, involving students from different backgrounds. How people participate, so not just through technical analysis, but through art, movement, storytelling, right? Which lowers the barriers to engaging with complex data. What counts as knowledge? So valuing lived experience alongside geospatial data, creating spaces where different ways of knowing can contribute, and then who can access and use the work. So making environmental knowledge more accessible beyond academia. And these things feed back with one another. I also bring a strong external funding track record and experience building interdisciplinary research and training infrastructure. So that really positions me to build a lab here that bridges scientific and creative funding ecosystems, as well as disciplinary cultures. And I'd be really excited to do that. So moving forward, I'm interested in advancing both the technical and experiential dimensions of the work. This includes developing more sophisticated creative technologies alongside deeper attention to user experience, particularly how people make meaning with immersive systems. So more broadly, I'm excited to bring environmental and social-ecological contexts into these spaces. So expanding how immersive systems are used to engage real-world environmental challenges. I also want to give just a few specific examples of how I anticipate I might expand my research platform, given the unique possibilities of being positioned in Atlas and eBio specifically, but also at CU Boulder more broadly. Things I think I could really only do here in this space. So the first is immersive environmental interfaces, which builds on the work that I showed in that first project. One direction is using immersive systems to improve ecological data collection, including model training and validation, that make for better empirical science. So, the bedrock of our models is that the data that feed into them are good, right? And I think AR can support that. So with drones and LiDAR, this is one example. So with drones and LiDAR, we often generate these detailed 3D representations of landscapes, but these models are validated with field data that look like this. So really sparse two-dimensional data. And you can imagine there's a lot left on the table there, right? So the general idea is to bring these 3D models back into the field using AR, so using headsets or tablets to directly compare them with the features they're meant to represent. So longer term, this could enable interactive tuning of model outputs in real time, improving representations of these features. And there are implications for applications like biomass monitoring or carbon estimation, but ultimately to support better empirical science, right? A second direction is using immersive systems to support dialogue around land management decisions. And I alluded to that a little bit in my first project here, but here these systems function as a shared environment where stakeholders can explore data-supported scenarios or even collaborative visioning of future landscapes. So using AR in particular allows these conversations to be situated in place, which can lead to more grounded and productive dialogue and support decision-making if they're effective at surfacing the values, assumptions, and uncertainties that shape those decisions as a critical piece. So the impact of virtual environments on user behavior, including decision-making, is an acknowledged gap in understanding that I'd be really excited to work on. The second direction is embodied in physiological systems, where I would use physiological sensing to better understand how people engage with content and experiences related to wildfire and environmental change more broadly. So I imagine partnerships with cognitive neuroscience and dance, as well as within Atlas and eBio here. So I mentioned early experiments using heart rate sensors with dancers, and I'm interested to expand that across a range of physiological responses, for example, respiration, skin conductivity, et cetera, and also beyond the performance context. So measuring responses to exhibitions, to stories, to informational content. So a second direction is developing feedback systems, feedback loops, where physiological signals dynamically influence projected environments. And this is really in the performance context. For example, heart rate or breath could be used to modulate the speed or intensity of a simulated or projected imagery, creating a loop between internal state and environmental data. So I'm also interested in how these dynamics extend beyond individuals to groups. There's a lot of work on synchrony, right, at Atlas, and in performance context, there's evidence that audiences synchronize physiologically, heart rate or movement during shared experiences, and that this synchrony is tied to engagement and immersion. And outside of the performance context, there's also evidence that synchronization of heart rate can signal conscious processing of narrative, and this example was with audio. And this opens up the possibility of studying not just individual responses to environmental content and experiences, but collective engagement with environmental content and experiences. I'm also interested in bringing my experience in embodied interaction into conversation with immersive environments in a human-computer interaction context, which is not an area I have experience with, but there's a big HCI strength here at Atlas. I think that would be an exciting opportunity. So one example is full body interaction with geospatial data, again, for data discovery and exploration that can support those analytical pipelines. Finally, I'm interested in human AI collaboration in the context of wildfire and other ecological contexts. So, wildfire systems they're data rich, they're high risk, but they're also extremely socially embedded, which makes them a really powerful test bed for human AI collaboration, right? AI can process large scale data, simulate scenarios, but it lacks context, right? Accountability and lived experience, of course. And humans bring those elements, but they're limited in scale and we're quite limited in speed as well. So I want to ask, how do we design systems where human and machine intelligence work together to support existing emergency operations and decision-making structures? So I'm interested in developing AI-assisted systems for wildfire modeling and interpretation that combine large-scale pattern detection with human judgment and contextual knowledge. This is relevant in real-time wildfire decision-making, but also extends into longer-term planning and risk communication. I also see strong opportunities for collaboration with eBio researchers working in quantitative and landscape ecology for other ecological contexts, which I'd be happy to chat more about with anyone. So in conclusion, this vision of an experiential environmental systems lab builds directly on what I've been developing throughout my career. Atlas is one of the few places where this kind of boundary crossing work, bringing together environmental system science and creative technology, can be central rather than peripheral. I'm especially drawn to the studio lab model and the culture of prototyping and experimentation here. I'd be really thrilled to be positioned at eBio as a home department, contributing to and advancing fundamental ecological and social-ecological systems knowledge. And what I find particularly compelling both about Atlas and eBio is their shared commitment to interdisciplinary research that advances knowledge while also engaging with societal challenges. So that combination, developing theory and tools while applying them in management, policy, and community context is central to my work. So CU Boulder more broadly has exceptional strength in environmental systems that I study across remote sensing, ecology, data science, and hazards research in the social science context. So I see a strong opportunity to connect those domains through creative technology, with Atlas serving as a bridge. I would see my role as helping to build that connective space, linking environmental data, disciplinary expertise, and design systems for understanding and for action. So I'm inspired by the work happening here, and I'd be excited to be able to build this work here. So this work's benefited from support of many colleagues, collaborators, and funding agencies. I'm fortunate to say there are too many to list individually here. I do want to mention a few, and thank you all for listening, for your time.
We have time for questions and lunch is coming.
Hard to be between you and lunch.
Can you give an example of Buto? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Would you show us?
Oh, man. Okay, let's do it together.
Show it.
Okay.
What is it?
Well, so the idea of Buto is that, again, the movement is generated from internal perception. So rather than demonstrating it for you, I'll be honest, I don't think it's particularly interesting to watch. It's very interesting to do. So we're going to do it together. Okay, so you can choose to close your eyes if you want. Actually, let's keep them open first. So first we'll attune ourselves to each other. If you place your hands on your heart and your stomach, I'm going to breathe and see if you can sync your breathing up. Breathing. Great, and now close your eyes and just ground yourself in the space. You can feel what your weight feels like distributed on the floor, no judgment, just notice if you're leaning left or right, forward or back. Is there tension in your shoulders? So we're attuning our bodies to itself and to the space. This would normally be a 30-minute long process, but just to give you a little sample. And then we're going to take visualization. So rather than worried at all about what your body is doing physically, you're going to think about, let's say, wind is blowing in through your mouth down into your stomach. And just let your body kind of move in response to that, however it wants to move. Feel free to stand up if you want to. You can stay sitting in your chair. And so rather than thinking about looking like, does my body look like wind is blowing it around? Instead, I'm thinking about what is that wind? Like, can I visualize wind well enough to actually feel it in my body? And then what does that do to my body as I move? So feel free to move your body if your body wants to move in response to that. No one can see you. Everyone's eyes are closed. Let yourself move. Maybe the wind comes from your stomach, out your arms. Maybe it goes down to your legs. Maybe stillness is what your body wants to do. Okay, and then feel free to open your eyes again. That's just a little sample of kind of the process of Butoh. So as I mentioned, other dance forms have a codified movement vocabulary, like your arm is supposed to be specifically like this. It's not meant to look any certain way. It doesn't actually matter what it looks like. It's about attuning your body to the visualization. So that's some of the process that we worked on through SciDance, was thinking about when we see that environmental data, the patterns in those data, the speed of those data, how can we internalize that in our body, and how does that help us understand those data? Not in an analytical sense. It's not like I can feel like the rate of change over time, right, in my body and come out with a number for that. It's more about a different way of engaging with data. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I just was wanting to experience it.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have actually a lot of questions, but one that was coming to mind during your talk was kind of about I think you spoke really well to how you see Atlas as a great fit for your research, and I'm just curious to hear about the challenges that you maybe face in your current position, which I didn't read your bio or anything before coming into the talk, but just as a sort of comparison, for what that movement would look like for you and what it would open up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in full transparency, I'm happy in my current position, but this would be just kind of ideal, right? And so one of the challenges, so in my current position at Boise State, I'll talk about sort of advantages and how they are even kind of better here. So I'm in a group called Human Environment Systems, which is already inherently interdisciplinary. Our faculty range from people with a social science lens to a strict ecology lens, just focus kind of broadly around the environment. We also, as I mentioned in the talk, have a games, interactive media, and mobile technology program that I interact with a lot. So I've worked with some of those student dev teams to develop some of the prototypes that I showed today. That works fine, but a disadvantage of that is that they're separate systems. And I know it sounds so trivial that they're not located structurally in the same place in the university, but it makes a big difference. And just one small example is that it takes 20 minutes to walk between buildings, right? And again, that doesn't feel like it should be a big barrier. But what that means is that people can't pop in and see each other quickly with a quick question, spin ideas off of each other. And I think just being in a shared collaborative space makes a big difference in how we engage with each other. It makes a big difference in how I can support students. So my own human environment system students are located right next to me. Basically, I have my office, they're right across the hall. And so we see each other often, many, many times a day, every single day. And the dev team with GIM, we make an appointment, right? I have to go there, we make it work, right? We make it work. And it's been a really wonderful and fruitful collaboration, but it just has to be structured in a way that I think limits some of that divergent thinking that's so powerful, right? So that's just being physically co-located, being structured in the same place. And then also that the GIM program is run by one person. And so, just the deep technical expertise here at Atlas, I think I would learn a lot from everyone in the room, including the students that are here, from the engineering, design systems perspective, from creating more sophisticated immersive technology tools, to thinking about user experience more critically and holistically. So I'm really excited about those pieces. I could probably answer that. I could answer that question for like 2 hours, but that's like the main pieces I can imagine.
Oh, can we,
Oh, check.
on the Zoom to get the owl? There's a request from the,
Sorry. I will note one more thing. Our eBio program, where most of our PhD students are enrolled, because we don't have our own curriculum, is like a 25-minute block. So that's another thing, just being in close proximity and in eBio as my home institution would also, and I think, improve that ability to connect the creative technology with the ecologies and social system science or social-ecological science. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. This was great. So at multiple points, even in your last slide, you speak about how everything is ultimately towards this idea of translating into action or kind of meaningful involvement in decision making. And I was wondering if you could talk about an example where you felt like you've been more successful at getting to that decision making stage.
Yeah.
Or what would that ideally look like in the future?
Absolutely. And I also don't mean to suggest that supporting decision making is the ultimate goal. I think it is sometimes, but kind of not always. Let me just go back. Don't mind. Sorry, it's gonna be a lot of clicking. But one example of when this was successful, I think, was in that. Okay, so let me just go back here. So I think of decision support as sort of one potential outcome and an important one, particularly from my perspective, when we're thinking about empirical or analytical ways of thinking, that again, like bridges a little bit with participatory. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, and this isn't true for everyone. Sometimes we do analytical and empirical work with the goal of advancing theory. It doesn't need to support decisions, but that's just something I'm personally very motivated by. I think a lot of people in eBio are motivated by that, but not everyone. And I think that's fine. I think the theory piece is important too. But just one example of when that's worked well, I think, is with the first project that I showed. So I mentioned the possibility of thermal imagery for identifying like microclimate refugia. So in sagebrush systems, there's a lot of money being poured into planting seedlings for sagebrush restoration. Survival rate, if you're lucky, is 20%, right? So really low survival, that would be good, but that would be a very successful project. And one of the reasons is that those plants are very limited by water. So being able to see moisture limitations and heat stress is critical to increase the survival rate of seedlings. And so often you have big teams of volunteers, and even if they're not volunteers, people don't typically carry advanced geospatial like data and or tools with them. And so being able to visualize the thermal imagery in real time on the landscape would allow people to identify planting sites where success, just one example. But so that's sort of practical, but another way I think you can successfully support decision-making, again, is giving people enough context and space to unearth those values and assumptions that I mentioned that really underpin a lot of decisions. So when we're thinking about scenarios or trade-offs of land management on a landscape, there's a lot of social values embedded in that. So even if thinning a forest is really good for lowering fire risk, the aesthetics might suffer, and that matters to people, right? And the way that people feel about their place and their home, that matters, you know? They don't want it to burn. They also don't want it to look like a big stump field, right? And so I get that. And I think sometimes scenarios or potential management action is abstract. It lives in this really abstract space. So allowing people to visualize that scenario, saying, what would this actually mean for this landscape? Can just inform their own conversation, right, in a way. And that's, again, where I would say that's successful supportive decision-making. And again, I've done that with VR tools, but not yet taking that into the landscape. But I think having it be situated in place, I think there's some research around, does having it situated in place unearth more information in those conversations? Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So I apologize for coming in.
Oh, no,
late, and
thanks for
we
joining
spoke
me.
earlier. And so if I'm asking a question that is like out of left field or fully deeply addressed, I have.
No, you go ahead.
So I'm just curious about where indigenous epistemologies and practices come in, and then how you deal with like scenarios like Colorado where we've displaced our indigenous populations for so long that a lot of those practices are lost.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night. I think that is a critical piece of this. And to me, a big question mark that like absolutely needs to be addressed. So right now, one example of some work I'm doing There's a collaborative around forest and grassland management for an area that supports the Cassia crossbill, which people last night at dinner told me is not its own species, but right now it's recognized as its own species. And that involves some land that is of critical importance, cultural importance to a First Nations community that lives adjacent there. So bringing all those different ways of knowing into conversation has been, in that sense, like very successful, just recognizing that here's some geospatial tools. Not all knowledge can be represented with geospatial tools. On the other hand, a lot of land management decisions, particularly by federal agencies or state agencies, are made with decision frameworks that rely on these geospatial data interfaces. And so in some way, even though those are imperfect data and creative technology is an imperfect tool for representing knowledge in a lot of ways, right? The reality on the ground is that like those data are informing decisions, right? And so how do we bring that type of thinking into conversation with Indigenous knowledge, which is critical? And I think, in the wildfire space, we were chatting about this last night, there's been a lot of progress in California around this, about acknowledging how critical cultural practices are, in part for the ecosystem, but also out of respect for the deep value that those kind of practices have. And Canada is a step ahead of us, or like many, many steps ahead of us, particularly in British Columbia, where they're actually returning some of that forested land to the First Nations community. So we're not there yet, right, in the United States, but I do think it is critical to like bring that Indigenous knowledge in conversation with Western ways of thinking, in all spaces, but especially in the wildfire space. Yeah. And so far that's looked like slow, thoughtful conversation, relationship building, right?
Thanks.
Yeah, but absolutely, like in what ways could these AR supported scenario visualizations support that kind of knowledge, or is that a barrier to incorporating that kind of knowledge? I think that's important to address and center. Yeah, thanks for that question. Not out of left field at all. Yeah.
I can ask about the land managers and decision makers, and it seems like the ways in which you're presenting information is probably pretty intuitive to them.
Mhm.
But I'm also curious about how, like, their training has sort of influenced their ability to take in new information. Like,
Yeah.
if they're basically trained to really lean heavily on empirical inference as a
Yeah.
decision-making tool, like to what extent is there resistance or
Yeah.
hurdles to overcome to bring in the new information?
Yeah, and and you bring up a really good underlying point, which is that anytime you're trying to support decision making, you have to like be aware of and be sensitive to the knowledge framework that those people are coming from, right? And so in that context, like a lot of the land managers we work with are actually living in this space, right? I have not yet moved into the space where I'm thinking about decision making like in this space, right? And right now, just off the cuff, I don't know what that would look like. I think that's like a really interesting, outstanding question. But I think, like to your question, people that we've worked with so far, again, even if they haven't had geospatial training, they're used to looking at maps and thinking about spatial prioritization in that way, right? And so this kind of work is sort of in line with what their ways of thinking already are. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
wonder if some of it is like a release, like a license for them to think differently from the way that they've been trained.
Yeah.
To think,
Right.
like, historically.
Yeah, I think that's right. And especially with the dialogue and lived experience piece, I'm finding that a lot of these land managers, I'll just use the example of in Idaho, we have the Idaho Department of Lands, who does use, again, like one of those geospatial databases to make their decisions about how they allocate grants for fire mitigation, for example. And they have a deep interest in understanding community perspective. And they're very familiar with communities. They work hand in hand with communities. It's not as if they're in some office looking at their geospatial database, not considering those things, but they don't know how to bring those data into conversation with their existing decision support tools, right? And so that's a space I'm really interested in. Like that's sort of a perfect area where a land manager wants to incorporate community information, desires, interests, values more, but isn't quite sure how to bridge that gap.
Okay. Sorry, I've I was just thinking about David's title on data is power. Anyway,
Oh.
so I'm gonna close the talk and I think we have lunch. No, not yet. I'm gonna keep asking questions then. Let's drink. Yeah.
You're not intellectuals.
We'll be on the air.
Light lunch.
I think Brian ordered from the company, so anyway.
It's coming.
Okay, go ahead.
Can I
Yeah,
ask another one
sure.
then?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure, go.
I was really curious about the science part
Yeah.
of your talk. And, the degree to which the dancers leveraged the raw data versus the degree to which that was translated through empirical inference and then provided to the dancers, like.
Yeah, yeah. No, that,
It just seems like a very interesting,
yeah,
alternative pathway.
I love that question.
Yeah.
And we did both, but we
Okay.
started with the empirical inference. So the scientists first gave their science debrief, and then some of the improvisational exercise used the raw data,
Okay.
right? And we, again, the work was developed in a studio setting. It wasn't developed, unfortunately, in the black box space here. So we were working, we had a projector, but it was relatively small, right? It wasn't touchscreen enabled, but yeah, dancers did look a little bit at the raw data. For example, for mine, I had some animations of fire over time, which were like a little bit similar to what you saw at the very beginning of the talk, so that they could attune their bodies to like the speed of change, the size of fire events, that type of thing. But yeah, we did start with the inference. But I'm curious, like if that had happened the other way around, would the process have looked a little different? But that's an interesting question. Yeah.
I'd love to make the, oh, sorry, someone.
I was just gonna ask how you define how a community is affected by a fire, because I think about fires in California
Yeah.
affecting us here.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, which is, I think, the power of the participatory approach, because the communities define how they're affected by fire. So in some of these conversations, if an area has been directly burned, sometimes the impact of, again, the aesthetics of their landscape comes into question, but in other areas, it's smoke, right? And so, like you said, we're getting a lot of smoke from California here. And then in Boise, a lot of times the smoke funnels from the entire West Coast, like just like across the Snake River Plain where Boise is. And so smoke is a big piece of it, for sure. And so, yeah. So the communities are coming up with the way that fire impacts them. But we do show some of those social vulnerability visualizations to say, like, this is what the data are showing in part, so they can say, hey, but that's not representing this piece of the picture that's very real for us. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
interesting, you actually work on the Indonesia fire,
Mhm.
and when they burn all the, whatever the field, all the Southeast Asia was influenced, the air quality is not
Yes.
bearable. In Singapore, we have to wear masks because whatever the wind.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
like a long period of time, and so I
Right.
think that the government to ban burning.
Yes, it's so interesting that you bring that up, because that governmental burning ban created a huge perverse like a disincentive, because you probably know this, but people in Indonesia, community-based burning, the practice used to be that someone would burn their field, the whole community would gather around for that day to make sure that fire didn't escape the field. Everyone would be there, like ready to kind of manage the fire.
Okay.
But when the government banned the burning, there was then fear of enforcement of that ban. And so people were less willing to take the risk to support community burning. So fires were then more likely to escape after the burning ban. So like some of these, and Indonesia has such an interesting geopolitical history in general, but of centralized government, decentralization, so any of the very complicated political context. But I think that's one reason why that sort of participatory approach is so key, to partner with the large-scale geospatial approach, because if we're thinking about large-scale patterns, governmental policies that are instituted because of large-scale patterns, we might miss some of this human behavior that's functioning at finer scales. But yes, Singapore, I know, really suffers when Indonesia burns. It's yeah. So, Mark, were you gonna?
Sure, I'd love to believe that interacting universally with large scientific data sets is valuable in some way. I want
Yeah.
to believe that.
Yeah,
And I'm actually want to get more of that going on in our Black Box City,
Yeah.
which has been historically an art space only.
Yeah,
Only when I try to make a compelling case for that to others, I feel like I don't have. So could you help us understand what actually happens and what's the real benefit of doing that?
yeah, I think there are some outstanding questions around, like, we tried a few different like question formulation techniques that were paired with the visualizations. And I think that's where there's power. Like, how do you structure the thought making and the conversation in a way that those kind of visualizations, like, there's some emergent unique properties, right? And so I think that's one piece of it, like really thinking thoughtfully about how you're structuring the conversation in that space. But then, and then, so Sherry, your specific question was like, how do you make the case, or like, what can you do with it?
Grace and Ellen and I,
Yeah.
and maybe a few others have been trying to say, hey, we've got this amazing technical resource
Yeah.
downstairs. Can we put it to get a larger community involved in it?
Yeah.
And expands the intellectual space that we use it for.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then we'll talk to Adine and we'll go, oh, what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, so in my case, my data are landscape scale, but some of the patterns are happening at really small spatial scales.
Okay.
So from my perspective, one of the unique values of those spaces is just being able to look at multiscalar patterns simultaneously and also across time. Again, that's really hard to do on your tiny computer screen. You're gonna miss a lot of detail, right? And so I think most of us who engage in empirical research will spend some time doing data exploration. And sometimes that's quantitative, like looking at what time our data are too thin and we need to disregard those data, right? But sometimes it can just be visual. I think there's a lot of value in that for sure. If I were here, I'd definitely try to advocate for that too. I'd buy people coffee so they could come into this space and play with their data.
I mean, if
Yeah.
you were here when David's doing the podiums, and the fact that the whole aerial map of where the old Stapleton Airport and then the now new airport, and so you can see across time, like things disappear.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that was pretty revealing. And then when you have fully immersive and seeing like, where are you looking at satellite data of in the whole globe?
Yeah.
That was also interesting too. People start to recognize it. Wait, what's
Yeah.
that shape? Where is it wrapped?
So that's a really good point. It's not just the power of informing the analysis, but also the power of like seeing the implications, seeing trends over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see that. Yeah.
A spatial and
Yeah.
time, yeah.
Yeah.